Hi, and welcome back to my shop. I'm now at the point where I have the sides pretty much complete, and I have my grooves cut to receive the two steps. My next kind of part of this project is to determine exactly how wide I want those steps to be, or how far apart I want the two sides to be. I've played with lots of different widths, and this is the one that sort of was the most visually appealing. It was sort of well balanced. It's wide enough so that if someone did want to actually walk up it, they could fit a foot in there, no problem. Or if somebody wants to display something on it, they could easily do that. There's enough room for that. And then all I did was sort of measure between the insides of each of those grooves, and I'm showing 15 inches. So my plan then is to take each of the steps and make sure that I have a 15-inch difference between the shoulders of the tenons on each end that are going to go into mortises in these grooves that will hold this entire thing together. So my first step is really just to set the shoulders for each of the tenons, and basically I'm going to cut the tenons first because I'm going to use those to lay out where the mortises need to go, and I'll kind of show you later on why I decided to go that route. So first I just kind of picked a spot roughly 7.5 inches from the center of this board. Again, I want to lose the ends of this when I cut them out because that's where most of, if there's any level of snipe, it'll be on the end of the board. And I'm just going to go and set that shoulder with my marking knife. And all that's doing is severing those fibers so that when I do that cross cut, I'll get a nice clean line there. Next, I just set my line on the 15-inch mark on my ruler, and I'll just make a mark on this end. Now, this is kind of one of the few times I actually will be measuring anything here. Once I set this second shoulder, everything else is going to get measured referentially. So this doesn't have to be absolutely perfect. I'm just getting it so that it's roughly that 15-inch length, shoulder to shoulder. And then that will become the measure that I use for everything else. Then I'm just going to drop my knife in that existing mark, and I'm going to extend and square that line across the front. And I'm really focused on the front here because that's the show part of the piece, and that's where you're going to absolutely want to have your nicest, crispest line. Is crispest a word? Now over at the table saw, I have my top step in my miter gauge here, and I have it set so that I'm basically splitting that knife mark that I made. I darkened it a little bit. I'm not sure if you can see it on the camera or not. But I will run my first pass to set that shoulder just using my standard blade in the table saw. After I get those shoulders set, then I'll put the dado stack in here and remove the rest of the material. To remove the rest of the material for the tenon, I'm going to use my dado stack. Now you might ask, why am I not using my tenoning jig where I could just run it across the saw like this using the standard blade? The problem is this tenon is so wide or so deep that I'd have to have my blade set up really high, and with hard maple like this and a 1.5 horsepower saw, it's just not going to cut it. It's going to create a lot of burning and mess. So basically, the dado stack is the best alternative. I can't even really use a handsaw or a tenoning saw for this either, just because this is the top step and it's fairly wide. The bottom step is even wider and just be impossible. So I've got my miter gauge set so that I'm basically, I'm going to kind of split that existing kerf with the dado blade, And the other key concern or thing I need to keep in mind here is how deep this cut is going to be. So I did run a couple of test pieces with the cutoff from this stock. I'm ultimately trying to get to a 1/2 inch wide tenon. And I do want it to be exactly 1/2 inch wide because I'm going to be using 1/2 inch wide bits to waste out the mortise that it's going to fit into. So I have this set so that it should leave me a tenon that's just north of a 1/2 inch, and then I'll fine tune it by dialing in the height of the dado stack. Now that I've made my first pass, I can just take my calipers and double check, and I'm probably a 32nd to a 16th of an inch too thick here. So I'm just going to run it through a few more times just to fine tune that final thickness. After running a few more passes through and sort of fine tuning, I now have my tenon exactly 1/2 inch thick. Next, I need to start thinking about how I'm going to lay out my mortises and tenons. And because this is going to be a through tenon, you're obviously going to see it exposed on the outside. So I thought it would make sense if I were to cut some mock-up tenons out of blue tape to give me an idea what the layout will look like. And here's what I came up with. I have a 4-inch wide tenon on the bottom. Again, it's a 1/2 inch thick, and a 2.5 inch wide tenon at the top. And I think that helps me sort of balance out the sizes based on the width of the piece at both of those steps. It also gives me a wide enough tenon that I'm gonna get a good amount of support there. I do have the grooves cut on the insides to keep the step from racking in either direction like this, but certainly a wider tenon is gonna give me a bigger glue joint and more stability. With the piece now laid down on my bench and turned over again so we're looking at that groove that's going to house the first step, I just take the center scale side of my rule and I lay it down so that I can find roughly the center point of this groove. And I'll make a mark there, and I'll use that to offset 2 inches in either direction to lay out where that bottom mortise is going to go. This is where cutting the full-length tenon first, before cutting the mortises, is really going to come in handy. Because I can just lay this piece down, and then I can actually just scribe the top and the bottom of that mortise with the piece already sitting in that groove. So I know exactly where I need that top and bottom of the tenon to be, or the mortise to be to match the tenon. So I can just make a knife mark right there, and then use that to scribe my line. I then went ahead and just darkened my marking lines so that you can see this a little bit better. Now you can see exactly where that mortise needs to be cut into the piece. Now that I have all of my lines marked out where the mortise is going to go, I'm actually going to be using the drill press. And there's a very important reason behind that, and that is that the drill press is perfectly perpendicular to the surface here. I have a backer block underneath this piece, so I'm going to be able to drill this hole straight through from the inside of this piece, and it'll come out the back side and it'll be perfectly perpendicular to the surface. That way I'll know exactly how to connect my lines. I'll put one hole here, and then I'll just connect the dots on the other side, and that'll show me exactly where my mortise needs to be on the outside. And because I had that backer block underneath, the hole I get on the other side is very neat and clean. I've gone ahead now and drilled both my holes, basically setting the ends of the mortise and also defining the width. Again, the advantage to using a 1/2 inch width for that tenon is I can use a 1/2 inch drill bit to define its mating mortise. So all I have to do now is flip it over, and I can continue the marking of the mortise on the other side of the board. Now, because this second marking exercise is on the outside of my board, this is really the show side. There's nothing that's going to be hidden inside that groove on the other side. So I need to make this mark as clean and precise as possible. So I'm definitely using my marking knife for this operation. And I'll just basically get my rule so that it's just touching the very bottom of each of those drilled holes. I'll hold it down and then make my mark. And then repeat the process on the top. Then I'll just match my line on the top of my ruler, and then I'll use the end of it to square off the end of where my mortise goes, the tip. Now here's where a combination of sort of power tools and hand tools come into play. Now that I have all of my marks set, I'm going to go through with my mortising chisel and just make a series of chops. And because I already have these holes cut, I really don't have to worry about blowing anything out at the ends of the mortise. So I can kind of give these a good whack. Now the only challenge I have is that my mortising chisel, my only mortising chisel, is 3/8 of an inch. So it doesn't span the entire width. So I do have to sort of move back and forth. So it makes it a little bit more challenging, and I have to be just a little bit more careful. But I'll go all the way across and waste out about 1/8 of an inch deep if I can. And then I just go back and waste out that material. So at this stage, I've effectively defined that outside edge, which is really the most important part of that through mortise. Now that I have that kind of shoulder, if you will, defined, I can come back to the drill press and use that shoulder to make sure that I'm setting the bit perfectly within the boundaries of that. And then I'll drill the rest of my holes down through, and that'll make sure that this outside face doesn't have any drill marks or slight curves or a scalloped edge, because I really need to make sure that those lines stay nice and crisp. Now that I've drilled all those holes through, I've left myself with a minimal amount of chopping that I have to do. I just have to sort of clean up all the little extra bits that the drill left behind. But that's going to be a whole lot less work than chopping this entire mortise by hand. So after my final cleanup, I'm left with a nice, clean, square mortise. And I can just go in and double check and make sure it's actually a little bit tight. So I'll just clean it up a tiny bit more so that I get a nice fit, and I'm ready to fit the final tenon. With my mortises cut and the width of my tenon already in place, my last step here is to finally cut the tenon to width. So I do that just by lining up the very front of this piece, and I can see I've written front right here so that I can't screw this up, or at least I'll be less likely to. And I'll have the very bottom of this come in and just kiss where this curve rolls in. That's how I'm making sure I can align the left and right sides. So I know I have it in place now, and I can just lean in and put a little pencil mark where the end of each tenon needs to be. Now the key here is that I need to have made sure that the walls of those tenons, or of the mortises, are completely square. Otherwise, I'm measuring one width to one side of the mortise, but it's a different length or width on the other side. So that's a key to this whole thing, is making sure everything's perfectly square. I've decided to go with a handsaw for this operation for a couple reasons. For one, in order to cut the shoulders here, I would either need to set my table saw up really high and then put this in a jig so that it would balance on end. A little bit of a challenging operation. I really don't like my table saw blade up that high spinning without a guard. The other reason is, in order to cut along the shoulder here, I would need a really high blade, or I'd have to use the bandsaw. And the challenge with the bandsaw is that you always run the risk of it wandering a little bit and nicking the edge of this shoulder. So the handsaw is just going to be the absolute safest, and as you'll see, still a fairly easy operation. What I'm going to be using is this Bad Axe tenon saw, which there are probably 3 or 4 people that don't know already that I won this at Woodworking in America during the Hand Tool Olympics. So this is also sort of the first opportunity I've had to put this saw to use. One thing I will say about this saw is that it's large and heavy, but it's still fairly easy to get started. And then lastly, I'm just going to chamfer that top corner so that when this tenon goes in through the mortise, it's not going to blow anything out the back side, nor will I get any tear out on the end grain here. So with my tenon all cleaned up now, everything's nice and square, the tops are chamfered, I can pop this out and try a test fit. All right, so make sure I have this aligned right. Got my front edge marked here, and I'll just lay this down, and I am just a little tiny bit too wide. So all I need to do is go back and fine tune both these edges just a tiny bit, and it should slide in for me. And I'll give it another try. Sometimes this can take, 4 or 5 tries before you get it right. And that's okay. I mean, that's kind of the key to getting a really good fit. And here you can see the finished product coming through the other side. You can see I have nice crisp seam right there, as well as on the sides. And that's important. That's how you get a nice clean fitting through tenon. Now, of course, I'm going to ultimately flush cut this off, and then I'm going to drive wedges into the ends that'll expand this thing and hold it in place. And now for the moment of truth to see if it will all go together. And there is my very first look at what the final product will look like. It's pretty cool.